payments to schools, right?
So with Prop 98, really when you get to the point where maintenance factor is paid off, the Prop 98 guarantee is at where it should be. That's, the maintenance factor balance is really kind of the line of where it should be if you weren't funding at these lower levels, but it's all part of the constitutional formulas.
Right, that's right. Okay, now of course where it should be, at least where the minimum should be, where the bare minimum needs to be,
That's
right?
correct.
Yeah, and that was, the superintendent made a comment about how 98's actually been very kind of controversial in the education community because it set floors. Well, there's this whole ceiling floor kind of debate, and ultimately there's an argument. And CSBA actually opposed Proposition 98 when it was first put on the ballot because they saw that it was going to disincentivize increases beyond the bare minimum from year to year, because governors would basically say, this is just going to set us on an inflationary track, and so we're going to try to keep the minimum absolutely bare so as not to create longer term liability increases. And there's an argument to be made that 98 has been a real mixed story for schools because it perhaps ultimately set a de facto ceiling rather than floor for annual increases. Right? To some extent, yes? Right.
I think the goal of Prop 98 was just to ensure that education funding received the same share of state general fund that it received in 86-87. And to that amends that the goal has been met. The percentage is, roughly the state budget a little over 50% of the state general fund budget go towards education, and that's very similar as it was in 86-87.
Okay, well, that's good. It's good to know. Let me ask one question. We were talking a little about graduation rates. This is from Mr. Troy. Do you have any information about the correlation between full-time? There's been obviously a lot of debate, right now over full-time faculty and that whole conversation within the community college system. Actually, CSU and UC as well. Do you have a sense of, have there been studies about the relationship between graduation rates and full-time faculty rates within the system?
That's an excellent question. I'm not necessarily aware of any particular studies that examine that issue very closely. I think it's certainly something that we do hear from our campuses a lot. We've talked about some of the issues about why we think it's important to expand full-time faculty. And one of the issues goes back to the issues of what the chair said. If we're going to do these student equity plans and we're going to expand workforce, you do need some full-time faculty on campus in order to help design these programs and make sure they're implemented. Part-timers are very valuable to our system in terms of instruction, but it's difficult for them to kind of participate in some of those committees. So I think most of the information we'd find would be more anecdotal than it would be what you're looking for, I think.
Okay. Do you know if anyone's studying this right now in California? Is there no?
Not offhand, but I think we'd be happy to see if we could find something for you and provide it to the committee.
I'd appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, thank you. Thank you.
Yes. Senator Morlock, go ahead.
Just when I was treasurer of the county, I got to be the treasurer of all the school districts, and so I try to do a bit of analysis, and they all tend to be a little different in how they're structured, especially as it relates to Prop 13. So I have one district, Irvine Unified School District, which was kind of small in 1978. And now Irvine's one of my biggest cities, but the amount of funding that's going to that district was based on really old metrics. And so they're not getting as much as other districts. Are we looking someday at
Equalization,
some parity or something that would kind of rectify that, or is, because I think I know I had Newport Mesa and Laguna Beach that went basic aid and just kind of said, hey, our property taxes are great, so why go through the average daily numbers that come through the system? I'm just curious, any thoughts? We talk about fair share and other concepts. Is that still tradition, or is there some?
That is something we are taking a look at it. We've got an ongoing series that's still being rolled out, but we're taking a look at that. There are some challenges for the legislature in equalizing. The voters have approved various measures that have limited the state's ability to shift property taxes around. And so it might be something where the state would have to go back to the voters to do a more comprehensive fix. But we're starting to digest some of the options and happy to keep you informed of those efforts as we go forward.
Okay.
And I would add that above and beyond just the property tax piece of that conversation is the fact that the administration, clearly our biggest priority within K-12, but one of the largest priorities for the governor throughout the entire budget is the LCFF, which is redistributing funding based on student demographics, which was not the case under the old revenue limit system. And so from our perspective, there is very broad equalization happening, and we're, under the governor's proposal, 95% of the way of fully implementing that equalization. And so from our perspective, we're looking at it more broadly than just property taxes.
And we're moving to a discussion particularly of LCFF with our next panel. So
Okay, thank
if you have questions on that, we might want to wait till we hear from the next panel.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Any other questions for this panel? Hearing none, I'd like to thank and excuse this panel and call up Aaron Heredia from the Department of Finance, Ryan Anderson from the LAO, and Deborah, you'll stay with us again.
Yeah. But you're asking me a question.
And we will begin with Aaron from the Department of Finance.
Morning, Chair and members. Aaron Heredia with the Department of Finance, here to present you with the 16-17 governor's budget for the local control funding formula. As my colleagues already alluded to, the governor is proposing a total of more than $55 billion in total funding for the LCFF for districts, school districts and charter schools in the budget year, with $2.8 billion of that going towards GAP or transition funding, getting us to about 49% of filling that remaining funding gap in the budget year, as well as 95% towards full implementation. The governor's budget also includes just over $1 billion in total funding for county offices of education. And I would like to note as well that they are fully implemented onto their funding formula as of the end of the 14-15 year. And with that, I'll keep my comments very brief and happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you. Move now to the LEO.
Good morning. Ryan Anderson, Legislative Analyst's Office. We recommend adopting the governor's proposal to spend $2.8 billion on LCFF transition. This is consistent with the legislature's prior year actions and accomplishes a number of important state goals. We would like to note, however, a concern we have with a particular provision of the LCFF as it applies to county offices of education. This is the minimum state aid provision, which ensures that as local property taxes continue to grow, county offices will receive unequal funding levels based not on the needs of their current student populations, but rather on which one received the most categorical funding under the previous funding system. We think that this represents a fundamental design flaw with the LCFF. In fact, that it works at cross purposes to the intent of the LCFF, and therefore recommend repealing this provision. Now, we estimate the cost of this provision is approximately $75 million in 16-17, but the cost is actually increasing year over year and may eventually reach several $100 million. Finally, staff has asked me to discuss an additional issue that's come to their attention. That's the treatment under LCFF of districts that briefly became basic aid districts during the Great Recession, but have since exited basic aid status. The story here is that during the Great Recession, the state made a number of cuts to revenue limits for all districts. Because these cuts to revenue limits did not affect the funding levels for basic aid districts, the state also imposed targeted fair share reductions to the categorical funding for those districts. When LCFF was first implemented, each district's initial funding level was determined by taking their last year's revenue limit, which included that across-the-board cut, as well as last year's categorical funding, which for basic aid districts included those fair share reductions. Now, for a small number of districts, the reductions to the revenue limits actually forced them into basic aid status, thereby subjecting them to the fair share reductions in their categorical funding as well. When their initial LCFF floor was set, we included both the full statutory amount of their revenue limit reduction as well as those fair share reduction to their categorical funding. And this double cutting, so to speak, has resulted in them receiving less money throughout the LCFF transition than they otherwise would have. These districts have asked members that the legislature reinstate the categorical funding that was cut from them in 12-13, starting in 2016-17. While our office has no recommendation on this issue at this time, I would be happy to answer any questions if you'd like to understand it better. That's all.
Thank you. Now move to Department of Education, Ms. Brown.
Good morning, Deborah Brown with Department of Education again. I think I just reiterate my comments before about we commend the administration for directing the increase in Prop 98 towards LCFF and really moving towards closing that gap, and just add that we continue to believe strongly that the best decisions about how to spend education dollars are made by teachers, administrators, and parents. And happy to answer any questions you may have.
Okay, a couple of questions. Does the department have a position? The two issues brought up by the LAO, I mean, it seems like there's a lot of kumbaya this year in terms of LCFF between finance and LAO, and that's great. There do seem to be these two issues. One, perhaps an overfunding of County Office of Education based on factors that we may want to change. And secondly, the underfunding of what I assume is a relative handful of basic aid districts. Does the department have a position on either of those issues?
So we don't have a position on the county office one at the moment, but we're looking into it. And then we're also acknowledge that there is an issue with the basic aid districts, and we're working with folks on potentially finding a solution to that.
Okay, and the administration is, of course, aware of these two issues. Any comments on them?
I think I would just say that we're aware of both of the issues, and they're both, as my colleague actually mentioned earlier, unique in a way to the way that schools are funded under revenue limits, and really the LCFF as school districts and charters transition to the formula, and as well as the formula is implemented for county offices, is something that's getting addressed through transition to the full target.
Okay, if we chose to fix both of these issues, assuming they're not fair, either an overfunding of one entity, the county office, or an underfunding of some basic aid, we could do that, right? I mean, the administration and Department of Finance, it's not beyond figuring out a way to fix these problems if we agree they're problems.
I think from a technical perspective, the department might be able to weigh in better on that, but
I think from our perspective, the fixes are technically possible, but not something that we can support at this time.
And why not?
So as my colleague, Mr. Heredia, just mentioned, for the issue of districts that used to be, or that have sort of, we call them flippers, flipped in and out of basic aid status, from our perspective, this is only an issue of where they are starting this transition, where they started the transition to their targets 3 years ago. And so while perhaps from where they started was a bit lower because of this nuance, and there are many nuances, by the way, beyond just this issue that the LCFF was passed to be able to address. While they are starting from a slightly lower place, that also means that they are getting a slightly larger piece of the pie. And as you mentioned in part of your comments, we've provided over or nearly $13 billion of new funding since the LCFF has been passed. And so it's not that we're aware of the issue, we just think that the fix is already in place, and that ultimate fix is the LCFF and getting them to their targets during this transition.
Okay, and with regard to the county offices?
In terms of county offices, again, an issue that we're aware of, the hold harmless was put in statute to ensure that no county office received less state aid under this LCFF, and that was, and to the extent that they received less state aid under the LCFF, that was viewed as harming them. And so, as part of the deal that was made when we passed LCFF, that provision was included, and that's where we are on that issue.
Okay. Department, any other comment?
Yeah, I would just say on the basic aid issue, if that's the will of the legislature, we can try to work to find some solutions to that.
Okay, thank you. That's my only question for this panel. Any other questions, Senator Morlock?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Maybe I can go back again then, now that I've been jump the gun, not the last panel, but are we saying, you use the term flippers, so let me expand on that. This is a district that's gone to basic aid during unique financial circumstances and found that they kind of got penalized a little bit and now want to go back, but now they're behind. So are we saying that that door is closed? It was just too bad?
I think what we're saying is, you're right. These are districts that, because of the reductions that were made during the Great Recession, their state entitlement was cut to a level that was lower than their property taxes. That made them, they were sort of cut into basic aid status. Basic aid status triggered, under the old antiquated revenue limit system, triggered an additional reduction, a basic aid fair share reduction. We don't disagree that that aspect of the old revenue limit system, like many aspects of the old revenue limit system from which we came, was flawed. But the solution to that problem from our perspective is implementing the local control funding formula where all school districts are funded based on their student characteristics, and we are transitioning all school districts at the same pace towards their ultimate LCFF targets.
Okay, so was there something unique with Santa Barbara Unified School District? Were they treated differently?
I'd have to get back, I'd have to look into that issue specifically. I'm not aware of it off the top.
Oh, okay, because someone's, you know, when you have kids, it's, you know, if something isn't fair, you're going to hear about it, right? So if you're going to treat someone differently than everyone else, then it pops up. So you may want to check into that, Santa Barbara Unified, because there's always excuse me, from my management standpoint, you want to take a philosophy of no better, no worse. You want to kind of treat everybody the same. So if you could follow up on that for me, I'd appreciate it. I think that's all I have, Mr. Chair, at this time.
Thank you, Mr. Morlock. Moving on to Senator Allen.
What is the Santa Barbara issue? I never heard of this.
What I have in my notes is that due to the dissolution of redevelopment agencies, Santa Barbara Unified School District became basic aid for 1 year and was slated to lose over $7 million in funding due to the fair share reduction. The legislature and the Department of Finance, after the LCFF had already been enacted, went back to the statutes and fixed the issue so Santa Barbara Unified wouldn't be cut. So the question then is, what about the other districts? Why can't they get the same resolution? And so that's what I'm saying, no better, no worse. What's good for war?
Okay, I gotcha.
And since
Yeah, really tricky.
Sorry, I would just add that, yeah, Santa Barbara is one of the ones that we've identified as one of those flippers. And so if there is language to fix it, they would be one of the districts that would be, that issue would be addressed for them.
Well, it sounds like they got something unique. And so now you've got the other kids in the classroom that are saying, hey, what about us? And so I just bring it to your attention. It's out there.
I'm sure this question betrays a lot of ignorance, but I thought that when you flip over to base, so what you're saying is you're talking about districts that just kind of went just barely into basic aid. So then they got this fair share cut, as opposed to ones that were sent strongly into basic aid, who were able to capture all that extra revenue. Is that basically what we're saying? There's different, because there's some, I know within the context of the discussion about the Santa Monica Malibu separating, for example, that Malibu would now be so far into basic aid that it wouldn't be penalized along the grounds of what we're talking about.
The issue really regards whether they have lost funding throughout the LCFF transition. And in order for that to be the case, they have to actually be being funded based on the LCFF entitlement. Districts that are traditionally considered basic aid, have always been basic aid, still are basic aid. They're not really affected by where their LCFF floor is because their funding is based on their local property taxes. The issue with the flippers is that they briefly entered and thus had this double cutting to their floor and have since exited.
Could the department get us a list of what districts those are that we're talking about? How many and which ones?
Yes, I believe we can do that,
Thank you.
and we will.
Appreciate it.
It's interesting.
It's sort of like that commercial where the guy finds out what someone else is being paid on the photocopier, you know?
Right.
And then everybody's like, what is going on?
Okay, well, if there are no further questions for this panel, I want to thank and excuse you. And now we go to our final panel of Part A of the hearing. We still have a whole other part to go. The final panel are two of the panelists who are up here right now, Deborah Brown and also Edgar Cabral. And we're going to be talking now about the federal Every Student Succeeds Act. Edgar, you're going to be starting on this one?
Yes, so good morning or probably good afternoon at this point. Edgar Cabral with the Legislative Analyst Office. We have a very brief two-page handout to just walk over some, we were asked to just provide some, a high-level overview of some of the changes in the Every Student Succeeds Act, which is the new law passed by the federal government, signed by the President December 10 of 2015, and this replaces the old No Child Left Behind Act. I'm going to provide some very high-level overview of some of the components of it, and then Ms. Brown will talk about the department and state board's timeline for making changes associated with what's called, I guess, ESSA or ESSA, some folks. So on page 1, we just try to provide a high-level overview of some of the changes to the funding formulas. Overall, these changes don't have a major effect on the amount of funding that the federal government is providing for education, but there are some changes to some of the various formulas. A lot of these are named by the components of the law, so Title I, Title II, Title III, et cetera. So just walking through three key ones we wanted to highlight. One is Title I, which is the Improving Academic Achievement section of the ESSA. The main formula remains unchanged, and that formula is provided based on the states based on counts of students in poverty. There is a change, though, in terms of the amount that the state must set aside for providing support to struggling schools. So previously it was 4%, and now that amount would go up to 7%. And so this is tied partly to the changes in the accountability structure. And there used to be a program called the School Improvement Grant that was a separate funding source to providing funding for providing support to some of these struggling schools. That program is gone, and so the intent is that this additional set-aside would be used to kind of replace some of those activities. The other one that, in terms of the sort of biggest change in the formula, I think is the Title II, which is improving teacher quality. And this is funding that's provided for training, professional development, or recruiting of teachers. And the Title II program overall, it's about $2 billion at national level. In California, in last year's budget, got about $250 million. The formula is changing, so it's a portion of it goes out based on overall student population, and then the other piece goes out based on the percentage of students in poverty in each state. The formula will be shifted so that a greater percentage of that formula is going out based on poverty counts. So right now it's about 65% of the formula is based on poverty. It'll move to 80%. And so for California, because we have a high percentage of students in poverty, that actually means we'll likely get additional funding. The last program that I mentioned is kind of a change, is Title IV, and mostly in the past, this was primarily 21st Century Schools. This is an after-school program that the federal government provides, and oftentimes districts use it along with their ACES funding, their after-school education and safety program that comes from the state level. There's a new student support and academic enrichment grant there that can be used for a variety of activities. It's kind of block grantition that has a lot of options for districts to use, and so it can be included for things like extracurricular activities, elective courses, counseling, accelerated learning, health and mental health education, technology. The idea is that these are kind of help for well-rounded education opportunities that are outside of just sort of the traditional academic requirements. So then moving to page 2, just talking about some of the major changes in accountability. So a lot of the big discussions and the major shifts are in the accountability side. They're not necessarily changes in overall funding. And I know that there's a meeting, a subcommittee hearing in April where we'll talk more in depth about accountability, but I did want to just highlight some of the major changes. We don't have anymore under this system, we don't have the sort of No Child Left Behind framework of adequate yearly progress and targets. that schools and districts need to meet, and then the prescriptive sort of sanctions or other requirements for schools and districts that are struggling. Instead, what the federal government says is, states, you develop an accountability model. You need to meet some certain requirements that we have, and we will approve your plan if it meets that. But it's no longer having this one federal system that works the same way across the country. There are a few pieces that are required. First, there's some specific components that states must measure, and that includes school academic achievement, four-year graduation rates if you're a secondary school, academic growth for elementary and middle schools, and progress on the proficiency of English learners. And then one additional indicator of school quality, and there is flexibility there. The intent there is that it will be something that's in addition to sort of the traditional test score measure. So it can include something like school climate or other measures that the state is now including in its own state priority areas. There are two levels of support that are required. So states are required to differentiate kind of schools and determine whether some schools might need some targeted support if they have student subgroups that are persistently underperforming. And then if those schools do not improve, providing sort of increasing action. And then a second category is comprehensive support, and these are intended to be schools that have a much more sort of systemic, persistent problem, persistently failing schools. And the law requires some specific schools that would need to get this comprehensive support, and that would be the lowest 5% of schools across the state, high schools where the graduation rate is less than 2/3, and then any school where there's a student subgroup that's performance is so low that they, on their own, would essentially be at that bottom 5% level. This law does not, and unlike No Child Left Behind, there are not very specific requirements for how you define these categories and then what specific actions states must take. There's a lot more flexibility, so states can determine sort of how do we decide what the lowest 5% of schools are, how do we decide whether there's a targeted subgroup, and then states can develop their own rules for how support will be provided and how state actions would change if those schools did not improve.